Canada has a serious drug problem. According to the federal government, over 34,000 Canadians have died from opioids since 2016. Now, to put that into perspective, that's roughly the same as taking two NHL-sized arenas and filling them with people. It's a serious issue. But this issue goes well beyond just simply people dying. There are serious strains that are put on our healthcare system, as well as first responders and our criminal justice system, because of this ongoing problem. Today we're going to talk with a documentary filmmaker and host of the popular online series Politics Explained, Aaron Gunn. He's produced two very popular videos on this issue that take a real in-depth look at these problems. Vancouver is dying, and more recently, Canada is dying. So today, let's have a chat with Aaron and learn more about this issue. Aaron, thanks for taking a few minutes to discuss this with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Colin. It's great to be here on the show.
Well, let's start off, Aaron, with the big picture. I mentioned there's about 34,000 deaths since 2016. Can you tell us about this problem a bit more, sort of with a national perspective?
Well, when it comes to the opioid crisis, or what people are calling the opioid crisis, I call it the addictions crisis. The level of carnage that is being left in its wake is really sad and quite shocking. Just last year, for example, more than 6,000 Canadians died from overdose. These are preventable deaths. These are mainly younger people between the ages of 20 and 59. These are mothers and fathers, sons and daughters across the country. And nowhere is it worse than where I'm based out of in British Columbia. More than a third of those deaths were in just one province alone, British Columbia. So the level of carnage is shocking. It should shock the conscience of most Canadians, and ideally wake up our politicians and push them into action.
And one of the things that I found interesting after watching both documentaries was that it seems to be an issue that isn't just affecting, I'll say sort of the down and out, but people from different walks of life in Canada. I mean, Marshall Smith, you interviewed him. He was a pretty successful guy, but got tied up in drugs. And then on the other hand, you had people that are a lot younger, maybe haven't started their careers. They're sort of, in a different socioeconomic situation. But is that sort of representative of what we're seeing in Canada, where it really is affecting people from all walks of life?
Oh, 100%. Addiction can hit anyone at any time. Obviously, if you start using these substances that British Columbia recently decriminalized, like crystal meth and fentanyl, these are very dangerous, destructive substances. And once you get kind of in the throes of addiction, it can be very difficult to get out, especially when you have, in the case of many Canadian provinces, government enabling and normalizing that kind of behavior instead of giving people that helping hand to turn their life around.
And so, when we think about this issue, I think a lot of people are familiar with it now. It seems like in a lot of big cities you drive around and you'll see people that are, clearly users of who knows what kind of drugs. But how and when did this problem really get out of hand? Because it doesn't seem like it was like this 20 years ago.
Well, the deaths from overdose have increased by 1,000% in Canada over the past 15 years. What really turbocharged it was when a company called Purdue Pharmaceuticals, started handing out, like candy, essentially, a drug called Oxycontin, which was a very powerful addictive opioid, and also something called Percocets, which was partially Oxycontin, partially Tylenol. And it created a huge wave of opioid addicts. Those addicts became very addicted to these drugs. And when we finally realized the problem and started to clamp down on those drugs, some people were able to get clean, and then others turned to street drugs like fentanyl, which were even more addictive, which were even more dangerous, and has led to a massive wave of overdose deaths since that over the past 15 years. So, but it all started with a company called Purdue Pharmaceuticals that flooded the market and flooded our streets with the OxyContin.
And, I want to come back to that in a moment, but one of the things that I loved about your documentary was that you actually walked the streets and you talked with people, various addicts, people living on the streets, but also those that were recovering from being addicted to drugs. So when we come back, I want to ask you about a couple of the stories that you brought to life in your videos.
Looking forward to it.
So we're talking about Canada's serious drug problem with documentary filmmaker Aaron Gunn. Aaron, before the break, I was talking about how one of the great things about your two videos is that you actually put on your shoes, walked the streets, went into the East Hastings area in Vancouver. You talked with people that are living on the streets to hear their stories, talking to people that were victims of crimes and so forth to really, I think, understand what was happening at the grassroots level. Could you tell us, first of all, are there any stories that really stand out in your mind from sort of the drug user perspective, people that you talk to?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we had very compelling conversations with, as you pointed out, people still living on the street. We also had very powerful conversations with individuals who were recently on the street and are now in recovery. One of the things that came up while we are chatting with homeless individuals, particularly in the BC city of Nanaimo, was how for them and the police and some of the bylaw enforcement people introduced us to individuals who had been homeless for a while in the city. So they had kind of a
Mm-hmm.
longer lens with which to view the recent changes. And what was so shocking was how blunt they were with us and my camera crew about how bad things have gotten from a public safety perspective. I mean, these are people that have been living on the streets in some cases for 5, 6, 7 years, and they've said this. They've never seen it this bad. That 9 out of 10 homeless people, for example, were carrying knives. That there were random violent attacks, and we have to remember, obviously we see these impacting the general public every single day in Canada, but no one is victimized more than other homeless people themselves. So that was a really powerful interview. And then also hearing from them just how many people they've lost from overdoses. I mean, the one individual we chatted about said in the last 2 weeks, 5 people that were relatively close to him had died from overdose. And to hear those shocking numbers is really a wake up call. And just shows how devastating the situation is. We also noticed that, quite frankly, some people on the streets were in different levels of denial. Some were quite frank about the problem that they had, that they were addicted to fentanyl. Others were
Mm-hmm.
less forthright and more cagey, and clearly still in that kind of denial part of their battle and struggle with addiction. So it was very interesting. It was very compelling. It was very unnerving at times, especially in Vancouver's downtown east side. But you have to
Mm-hmm.
go to the heart of it if you want to get the true story.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you did that. I've done the drive by myself so many years ago when I was in Vancouver. She showed me what was going on. I couldn't believe it. It was just, it looked like you're driving through a zombie land with countless people that are just, high on various drugs, and it's sad to see what they're going through in that. But obviously we need some changes. We'll get to that in a moment. But on the other side of this coin, you've got a lot of people that are victims because these users are doing whatever they can to get their hands on these substances, whether it's breaking into pharmacies or stealing people's things, attacking people. What were some of the stories from victims that you heard that really kind of put you back in your seat?
Yeah, well, there's two ways that drugs are fueling this kind of violent crime wave we have in Canada. Violence up 32% since 2015. One is for individuals committing various crimes to get money in order to buy their drugs to feed their addiction, which can reach up to $300 a day. Um,
Wow.
and the second is kind of drug-induced psychosis, which is causing some people to light fires uncontrollably, other people to smash windows uncontrollably, other people that violently attack, stab, or even murder individuals. Probably the most powerful story, though, that I chatted with was a woman, a mother named Barbara Persaud out of Chilliwack, BC. Her son was a victim of a random violent attack by someone who already had over 50 prior criminal convictions, many of them
Wow.
violent, many of them with a knife. Uh, Her son had gone to help a Good Samaritan, someone else who had been stabbed, and then he himself was stabbed by this individual 14 times through the heart, killing him. And as shocking as that was, that this guy was already out on the streets, and to see the pain in this mother's eyes, what was even more shocking was after this murder, uh, the culprit, the individual who committed the crime, received only 8 years in prison. like for this additional crime. And then because you get statutory parole after 2/3 of your sentence, and you receive time and a half for the time you serve kind of pre-trial, he was out in less than 6. So for murdering, taking somebody's life after you already have 50 previous convictions, he only received an additional 8 years, which to me was truly shocking. And you could just see the pain in this individual's eyes. So it was quite sad to see. But so that would probably be the most powerful interview that I conducted.
And we're going to pick up on that point right after the break. We'll talk more about the criminal justice system and the impact to it from what's happening. And we're back talking with Aaron Gunn, who is a filmmaker, who's produced 2 excellent documentaries that you can watch on YouTube, Canada is Dying and Vancouver is Dying. Aaron, before the break, you were talking with us a little bit about sort of the impact to everyday Canadians when they're victims from drug addicts attacking them, stealing their stuff, and so forth. One of the things that I thought you did quite well in Canada is Dying is not just looking at this issue on its own, but looking at how there's a real criminal justice element part to this. And you just gave an example of someone with a rap sheet of 50 prior convictions, and the individual was out on the streets and sadly killed someone. Are we seeing any kind of changes happening on that front? It sounds like provincial premiers and even some cities are sounding the alarm bell requesting change, but are we seeing anything actually change in that regard?
Well, unfortunately, no, especially on the serious violent offenders with multiple offenses. The federal government made the situation a lot worse, specifically to individuals out on bail with a bill called Bill C-75, which they basically opened the floodgates and allowed almost everybody other than the most heinous murderers basically out on bail while they were awaiting trial. The results, if we just take one city, the city of Edmonton, for example, in the past 3 years since this bill was passed, more than 2,100 assaults were committed by people out on bail for something else.
Wow.
They were involved in more than 24 homicides. And in the province of British Columbia, 75% of the individuals who were charged with a violent offense, who were already out on bail for another violent offense, were given bail again. So I know the federal government introduced a bill a couple weeks ago to try to walk back some of their own changes, but it doesn't go anywhere near far enough, and I'm sure it'll just be a drop in the bucket. There's a real problem with the culture and the ethos of our criminal justice system, where it keeps putting the interest of criminals definitely ahead of victims and their families, but even more recently ahead of the public, the safety of the public more generally. So that's a real problem with the culture of the entire system.
I want to come back to something you said there. I want to make sure I understand it correctly. You said there were 24 homicides. Is that those homicides were committed by people who were out on bail?
So that's in the last 3 years in the city of Edmonton alone. There were I believe it was 26. I'd have to double check the video, but more than 24 homicides where the individuals on bail either committed the homicides or are suspects. Obviously, this just happened, so maybe they've been charged with murder, and the case is currently before the courts and everything like that. But they were
Wow.
involved in a murder investigation in a negative way. We'll put it that. So maybe the broadest kind of way to
Wow.
encapsulate that. And we've seen very shocking public examples. In Ontario, for example, there was an OPP officer killed by an individual
Hmm.
who was released out on bail, even though the judge, if you read the bail hearing, basically said he's worried that this individual has a high risk of reoffending, and yet releases him anyways. So it's a serious problem here, and it's putting the public at risk.
Wow, those are certainly appalling stats. I think they speak to the need for bail reform. But let's talk about the other type of reform we need, which is actually dealing with these people who are addicted. They're living on the streets. It's not good for them. It's not good for society. Um, we've got sort of, I think, 2 diverging approaches to dealing with this issue. You talk about it quite well in your 2 videos. Sort of the Alberta approach and the BC approach. Why don't we start with sort of the BC approach and what they've been doing there for the past several years?
Yeah, well, it's a real fork in the road, as you alluded to there, Colin. In British Columbia, what the plan seems to be is hand out free drugs, enable and normalize, and in their words, and literally their words, destigmatize this kind of behavior, the abuse, substance abuse of hard drugs, and obviously it follows in the path of decriminalization of everything from heroin to crystal meth to crack cocaine to fentanyl, and also their massive push for a so-called safe supply, which is basically the government provision of opioids en masse into onto our streets and into the general public.
And who is it that's we've only got about 20 seconds, but who is it that's actually creating these drugs for the government to hand out that's part of the safe supply?
Well, amazingly, the main drug that's being used as part of the so-called safe supply is a drug called Dilaudid. It's an opioid that's about 3 times more powerful than OxyContin, which started this crisis, the opioid crisis, in the first place. And surprise, surprise, Colin, it's actually made by the same company, Purdue Pharmaceuticals.
It's incredible, especially what the history has shown us with that company and what's been going on. We'll be back more right after the break. So we're back talking about Canada's drug problem with filmmaker Aaron Gunn, who's got 2 exceptional videos on YouTube. Canada is dying and Vancouver is dying. Aaron, before the break, we're talking about sort of the BC approach to dealing with addiction and people living on the streets who are addicted to opioids. With the BC model, they're basically giving out free drugs to people. But one of the things that's shocking in your video is you show how these addicts are taking these free drugs, selling them often to kids in high schools and junior highs and that. And then they're taking those dollars to go out and buy the real drugs, which they actually want. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, we found ample evidence of it. It's out in the open. It's no secret. The pharmacist openly shared to us what was happening. The addicts on the street openly shared to us what was happening. Specifically, what's going on here is they're being prescribed the so-called safe supply, which are powerful addictive opioids, hydromorphone, brand name Dilaudid. And then what they do, because they're not addicted to that specific opioid, they've kind of graduated up to fentanyl. That's the high that they need. That's the high that they want. So they go to their drug dealer. They either sell the Dilaudid tablets to them or trade them directly for the fentanyl. And then the drug dealers go to college campuses, university campuses, even high schools, and sell these kind of what you might call entry level opioids to these young kids who don't know any better. All they know, it comes from a pharmacy. It's called safe supply. They think it's safe, and they take it, and it's not safe. It's not remotely safe, and what we're doing is we're creating the next generation of addicts.
You know, my jaw dropped when you talked about in your documentary how the government went to court with Purdue and other pharmaceutical companies because of the products that they're making and how addictive they were. And then now they're buying even more powerful drugs from these companies, and they're handing them out for free on the streets. And then, as you just described, these people who are getting them for free or selling them, and so they can buy the more powerful stuff. It just sounds like madness. But we could talk all day about BC. Could you give us a little bit of insight into the Alberta approach and how that's different?
Yeah, so Alberta's going in the completely opposite direction. So they found out, the premier found out that the federal government was pushing the safe supply program in their province. They stopped it. There's none of this handing out of free drugs happening now in Alberta. Instead, what they brought in is what they call the Alberta model. It's a recovery oriented system of care that's based around hope. It's based around getting people better, and it's based around getting people off drugs, quite frankly, and returning them to being productive, tax-paying members of society again. And it's been quite successful. We've seen opioid deaths already, even though this has just started, start to drop off in Alberta from their peak during the pandemic, while in British Columbia, the opioid deaths have continued to rise. So, we still need a couple more years here of evidence, but the data is already starting to stream in, and it seems quite obvious. Maybe it's not surprising that when you enable drug use in one province while disincentivizing it in another, you get different results.
Yeah, and that was incredible when you talk about those big picture results at the end of your documentary there, Canada is dying, just that it looks like one model seems to be doing better and the other one. Just quickly in Alberta, if you still want access to safe supply, I believe there are still these safe injection sites or whatever around the province. What is it that's available? How do they actually deal with people?
Well, what's not happening in Alberta, which is happening in BC. In BC, you can walk into a drugstore and they'll basically give you a pill bottle full of this so-called safe supply. It's basically tablet heroin, and you can walk out and then you can do whatever with the drugs. That doesn't happen in Alberta. They do still have safe injection sites, but I also know they're
Mhm.
using those safe injection sites to try to direct people that come through those doors to treatment, as opposed to having them run like they are in BC by these kind of pro-drug activist groups who don't get anybody into treatment. So it's there's still some level of harm reduction, but or what's called harm reduction, but compare that to BC, where that's all they're doing, and so it's quite a shocking difference between the two provinces.
Aaron, you've done fantastic work on this file. I think bringing these issues to light and tying together a bunch of loose ends so that people can see the full picture. If viewers want to learn more about your work, how can they see what you're up to?
You can check out all my socials at aarongunn.ca, and you can watch the video for free on YouTube and Facebook.
Thanks for joining me. So there you have it. Canada has a serious drug problem. And it obviously looks like good intentions just haven't materialized the way that governments were hoping for with treating this issue. Again, I highly recommend taking a look at these two documentaries on YouTube. Canada is Dying and Vancouver is Dying. Thanks for joining us today on Second Street.